Okay, students, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whenever you're watching this video. This video is for History 1301, and it can be used in a 16-week class for the Era of Good Feelings to the Age of Jackson, and pretty much from 1815 to 1840. Okay, and for the 16 8-week class, it can be used for Unit 2, which will be 1815 to 1870. Okay, so remember, it can be used for both. It's just Era of Good Feelings, what we're going to cover. And in a previous, in the introduction of the Era of Good Feelings, what I want to tell you all is Era of Good Feelings is a period of relative tranquility. It's over. It begins in 1815 with the election of James Monroe. It is a period where we see, like I said before, national harmony. That's why it's called the Era of Good Feelings. One of the things that President Monroe is going to do is that he's not going to be too hands-on when it comes to like the Panic of 1819. Remember, the Panic of 1819 happened for two reasons. Number one, during the War of 1812, American merchants and businessmen were making a lot of money, trading both with the United States and the French and the British. And then, of course, you have the liberalization of the sale of land because of the Louisiana territory. And what happens is a lot of people that shouldn't have purchased the land purchase it, and they don't have a way to pay it back. And that adds to the panic. Okay, but the panic actually begins earlier in the embargo of 1809 with Jackson. Remember the old grab me? And then it just steadily begins to decline. It kind of just like goes away for a little bit. And then what we have is that we have the War of 1812 that kind of puts a little stop on the panic. And then when the war ends from 16 to 19, we see a panic, a really big decline that's happening. The other thing that we see is that we see a rise of nationalism. Okay, we're going to have like the Adams-Onis Treaty. We're going to see the passing of the Compromise of 1820, and of course the Monroe Doctrine that we still use today sometimes. Okay, that is still invoked by some presidents. Okay, which it rightly should be, right? So those things, we also have the rise of the American system and the Great Triumvirate. Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster. Henry Clay from the west, John C. Calhoun from the south, South Carolina, and Daniel Webster northeast from Massachusetts. Henry Clay hails from Illinois. Okay? At this time also we begin to see individuals move away from political differences and shape and focus more on public interests, okay? Infrastructure, canals, road building, those kind of things that are important for the country and are very well needed. It is, like I said again, a very good period in the history of the United States. Now, Madison was from Virginia, and he is elected in 1816. He succeeds James Madison. And one of the first things that he does is that he begins to expand on the borders, okay, with the purchase of the Adams-Onis Treaty. West Florida is annexed in 1810 through 1812, but then Andrew Jackson begins to make some unauthorized ventures into Florida because of Native Americans moving into Georgia and such, and then eventually is able to put enough pressure on the Spanish to sell Florida to the United States under the Treaty of Adams-Onis for $10 million. So you can see the price of land going up because Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory for $15 million, and then he goes and he buys, Monroe buys Spanish Florida for $10 million. So you begin to see that land is getting more and more expensive as we're going along. And of course, that is going to also put somewhat of an end to Native American uprisings in Florida. Rightfully so. I mean, we were encroaching on their lands and they were pushing back. By this time, we're going to see that by 1840, a lot of people are living west of the Appalachians and in new territories and parcels that had been sold. We have the creation of 8 new states by 1850, and of course we are going to have to deal with issues of squatting and preemption. So in 1841, Congress is going to approve a permanent right of preemption, and it causes many people to move west. Okay, they went west to escape overpopulation, the rising land cost, and worn out soil. Okay, they do bring their cultures with them, and we begin to see that the myth of self-reliant farms is not going to be the way things are going to go, other than actually what prevailed in the West was cooperation and community efforts in order to survive. Okay, so let's move on to the Era of Good Feelings proper. Okay, the politics in the Era of Good Feelings are going to be pretty cut and dry. Okay, by this time the Federalist Party is died as a national party. You still have some Federalists that will eventually become Whigs, but for the most part, most people were Republicans. Okay, and they did adopt some methods from Federalists. Of course, you're going to have more conservative Republicans, okay, and more liberal. We begin to see the emergence of Henry Clay's American system in 1816, which is high tariffs, which is not going to be good, okay, and the rise of the Second National Bank, federal aid for improvements, aid for internal improvements, which is very controversial at the time. And then there's also going to be sectional conflict over who benefits from this, okay? Now, Madison and Monroe saw these as constitutional conflicts, whereas Henry Clay, Calhoun, and Webster saw them as regional conflicts where people could work in bipartisan efforts to get what they wanted. The idea of Henry Clay's American system was to create a second national bank and to create a currency, that would be traded, create a strong currency, and then create a road system that connected the North, the South, and the West together. Create a system with currency that was strong so we could export raw materials and import finished goods. And then with a road system, we could distribute them to the other states in the country. And more importantly, that each region had an economic specialization. Now, for the most part, the South is the one that they've had the most problems with because their sole commodity was cotton, whereas in the Northeast you had import-export and finished goods, textiles, the emergence of textiles and stuff like that, and the importation of finished goods. In the West didn't really care too much about tariffs or about levying taxes, as long as their infrastructure improved and they were able to get their goods down the Mississippi, out New Orleans, out to the Gulf of Mexico, and then into northeastern economies where they could be exported, or roads, right? So as long as Henry Clay was getting internal improvements for the West, people tended to be pretty happy. So all of the states in the Great Lakes area, like Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, as long as we were able to get their goods and move them east or move them south and then out the Gulf of Mexico and then to Europe, everything was going to be fine. So for the most part, the northeastern states, or men like Daniel Webster, were able to more easily deal with the West than they were to deal with the South. Because remember, if you put a tariff on goods coming in from abroad, then when those goods came in, they were more expensive. And then when they were sold to the South, because the South had very little industrial output of producing finished goods, those goods were going to be more expensive, which means that their cotton was going to be worth a lot less. It's going to depreciate the value of their cotton, and that was going to create some serious problems for them. Okay, and of course the North didn't want to invest in the South because they embraced the institution of slavery. And as long as they embraced the institution of slavery, the North was going to be like, no, we're not going to go and invest any considerable amount of money. I'm sorry about that. I was distracted there for a minute. It's moving some stuff around on the computer. I'm sorry. They were not going to invest in the South as long as their money was associated, as long as their investment was associated with slavery. Now, one of the things that we begin to see in 1812 is we begin to see the emergence of state banks. And the problem with state bank, students, is that they are also dealing with state currencies, wildcat banks that are, producing their own regional currency. And that's going to create a big problem. So the idea was under Henry Clay's American system was to standardize the financial system of the United States through the Second Bank of the United States. And what it would do, what the Second National Bank was created to do, was to keep state banks in check, to make sure that they were adequately funding or distributing the money that they were taking in. And that in itself was a pretty big task, and it worked. Now, the reason they wanted to do this is, remember, one of the reasons that we were in trouble during the Panic of 1819 is because of easy credit. And actually, during the Panic of 1819, we see even more credit because the banks want to bring in more money. So as we're getting into the Panic of 1819, which is sparked by easy credit, we still see them kind of dabbling in the idea that they're going to continue to extend some credit so they can bring in some money, and it kind of backfires on them. I know that doesn't make any sense, but what happens here is that they still lend money, but they really increase interest rates, and that's because they want to make up the shortfalls that they had before. The other thing is that we're on the gold standard, and they want to move to the silver standard to back up paper. Of course, we don't go to the silver standard. There are other attempts in the 1890s to go to the silver standard, 1870s and 1890s, but you have to have gold to back up the paper money. And what ends up happening is that now we're on a fiat system, that our money, the value of our money is based on consumer credit, or fiat, as we say it. We determine the value of what money's worth. Now, moving on to sectional conflict and politics, we have to deal with the Missouri Compromise. Okay, and the Missouri Compromise happens when Maine and Missouri apply for statehood. It's pretty obvious that in 1820 that Maine is going to be allowed as a free state because it's in the northeastern United States, but Missouri is a little different. Missouri is up above the 3630 line, and the idea was that no slavery should exist between the 3630 line. And what we're going to do is that in order to maintain the balance of power, Missouri is admitted as a slave state. And what they say is that after this, no states over the 3630 line will be allowed to have slavery. And this is going to create some serious problems later on, because if you look at the map, you still have what is Texas and Oklahoma and Arizona and New Mexico, and all those states that belong to Spain at this time. And so what are we going to do about that? That may create some problems. I shouldn't say may. It is going to create some problems later on, because the South is going to begin to run out of territory. And what eventually is going to happen is that the North is going to just get tired of catering to the South, and you're going to have the Civil War happen. Okay, so at this time, Missouri is admitted to the Union as a slave state. Of course, it was a slave state, but the bottom line is that it wasn't a really solid slave state. Their constitution did protect freed African Americans, and it wasn't one of these states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, where slave, and it's going to create some problems later on during the Kansas, Nebraska. Okay, so the Compromise of 1820, or the Missouri Compromise, would definitely be on your exam. Most of the material that has come out of my mouth right now, it's going to be on your exam. Okay, don't say I didn't tell you. Now, also during this time, we begin to see a period where you begin to see a lot of Supreme Court cases come out. Okay, this is under the Marshall Court. Chief Justice John Marshall, in my opinion, probably the best Supreme Court justice that has ever sat on the Supreme Court. What Marshall does is that he broadens the power of the federal government at the state's expenses. Okay, and his rulings encourage the growth of a national economy. But at this time, he still maintained the power of the court at hand. So while he did give a lot of power to the federal government, he still made it sure that the federal government knew that the power to give power to the federal government lie in the court system, which is the way it's supposed to be, right? I guess, depending on whose side you're on, right? So in one of the first, in 1819, and there's two cases in 1819 and one in 1824 that are very important, Dartmouth College versus Woodard. And what we have here is that the Supreme Court rules that the state of New Hampshire had violated a contract clause in its attempt to install a new board of members for Dartmouth College. So Dartmouth College goes from a private to a public institution. And when they do that, they want to get rid of the board. And they can't do that because those board members are still under contract. And Marshall says you have to wait until those contracts are satisfied, and then you can reelect them. That's the way it would be, or reappoint them at the end of their appointment. So that strengthens the contract system. Like you have a contract, somebody gives you a contract to work for a year, they want to fire you 6 months in. Well, you can't do that. They're going to have to pay you the rest of the 6 months, or they're going to have to come to an agreement with you, and that actually protects individual states, or protects everybody all the way around. Now the next one in 1819 is McCullough versus Maryland, and again, this is a very important Supreme Court case regarding federal power, and in a unanimous decision. Okay, and I don't remember the other Supreme Court justice, Samuel Chase, and I don't remember. The court established that Congress had the implied constitutional power to create a national bank that individuals could not federally tax. Okay, so what happens here, this is an issue of supremacy. So the state governments do not have the ability to tax federal entities, post office, federal courts, banks, anything that is tied into the federal government. The states are not allowed to tax. So they're immune from that. And so it says here that the creation of a national bank within an individual state cannot federally tax a chartered bank, okay, or any federal entity. In 24, we're going to see, of course, Gibbons v. Ogden. And this is the Supreme Court decides that it's going to forbid states from enacting any legislation that is going to interfere with Congress's right to regulate commerce among the separate states. So if Congress says that you can move corn from Texas to Mississippi, and Louisiana decides that they don't want you to go through there, they don't have the right to tell you that you can't do it. And this is mainly done for slavery, okay? So at this time we have the movement of slaves, and the federal government decide whether you can move them through state lines or not. Today, a very easy example could be something like an individual is doing something illegal in Texas, and then he moves whatever he is illegally moving to Kansas. So then he's going to pick up a charge in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, but then the umbrella charge is going to be the federal charge because he kidnapped somebody within a state. It's kidnapping. If you kidnap somebody and move them across state lines, it then becomes a federal. So then the federal government can charge you, then Kansas can charge you, then Oklahoma can charge you, and then Texas can charge you individually after that. Okay. Now what this is going to do is that it's going to exemplify the nationalist trend for the period. The federal government should promote growth of prosperous nationwide capitalist economy. And this is the rise of nationalism. So it was done well, okay? And we begin to see this nationalism. By the 1820s, beginning in 1810, the Mexican Revolution starts, the Mexican independence movement. Not to be confused with Cinco de Mayo or the Mexican Revolution, their civil war, but this is the Mexican independence movement. I erroneously called it the Mexican Revolution. It is called the Mexican independence movement. A lot of these countries in Latin America, because of Simón Bolívar and Agustín de Iturbide and Manuel Hidalgo, are beginning to push back on the Spaniards. And in 1821, Mexico becomes Mexico. goes from being America to La Nueva España to Mexico, which is now, okay? And other countries in South America also begin to follow suit. Colombia, Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil. Simon Bolivar just kind of goes on this little venture of liberating South American countries and getting rid of the Spaniards. And what begins to happen is that countries like England and Spain begin to cast coveted eyes on these countries and think about, the Spanish and contact the French and the English and saying, can you help us out in suppressing these rebellions? And the United States under Monroe opposes European expansion into the Western Hemisphere, and that the United States would not interfere in European affairs. So in the Monroe Doctrine, he says, the Western Hemisphere is closed to colonization. Now the British and most Europeans just dismiss this and say it's not worth the paper it is written on. But to this day, if I'm not mistaken, the Monroe Doctrine has not been violated. Okay? And this signifies Americans' new sense of independence and self-confidence, which is a very bold statement to say that, because actually the United States did not have the military or the Navy or the money to back it up. If we had to go help one of these countries, it was going to be a very big task financially, and when it comes to people and supplies and stuff like this. It's going to be it would have been almost a disaster, but it doesn't happen. Now we're also going to see a rise in transportation. We're going to have the building of canals. We're going to see the emergence of the steamboat, by Robert Fulton, where he decides to put a steam engine on a boat. We're going to have the creation of the flat bottom boat by Captain Henry Shreve, and of course they named Shreveport after him. So after the War of 1812, one of the results is that we have really bad transportation, really bad infrastructure system. We cannot move our cash crops. We cannot move our industrial goods that we produce, or finished goods, to and from, and we cannot move our raw materials, cash crops, because they're going to spoil. So you begin to see the national road from Cumberland, Maryland to Vidalia, Illinois, which is going to be. Now, this is not a highway. This is pretty much like a dirt road with some improvements and some bridges as we're going along. Okay? So you're going to have that. You're going to see that, and that's going to be a good thing. You're going to see the emergence of turnpikes. It's the emergence of a toll road that are chartered by states. So you could have areas of the Cumberland Road or the National Road that are really good, but you have to pay money. Or you have to go, like now, you have to go on the access road or whatever it may be. Roads were very useful, for travelers, but too expensive for the transportation of bulk goods, Water is the most efficient, and that's why we can float stuff down the Mississippi and then put it on a steamship out to New Orleans and Gulf of Mexico, and then that actually took less amount of time to move those goods, A lot of times what individuals would do is that they would make a raft out of lumber, put their cash crops on it, float their goods and the lumber out to New Orleans, sell their cash goods and their lumber, and then maybe perhaps buy a horse or something, make their journey back up, then plant again and do the same thing. Flat bottom boats were the champions of transportation, and they predominated transportation at this time. The other thing that they did is they created a culture of its own on the Mississippi. The Mississippi flat bottom boat culture. It was very. So I said before, steamboats transported goods upriver. In 1811, Robert Fulton installs a steam engine on a boat, and Captain Henry Shreve designs a flat bottom boat. The problem with steam boats is that they were very dangerous. We didn't have good access to steel. Some of the boilers were made out of iron. The hot boilers came in contact with cold water. You had explosions like that. You also had just boilers that were not well made, too much pressure, and they would explode. Most of these steamboats catered to passengers, like a luxury atmosphere, but again, they were very dangerous. There was a lot of really bad accidents happened. They did, however, these accidents stimulated the antebellum congressional effort to establish safety regulations for steamboats. So at this time, even as early as 1812, 1815, 1820, you begin to see a drive for safety in steamships or in steamboats. Now, of course, we have the largest spectacular achievement of this time, which was the Erie Canal of 1825, which the Erie Canal links New York City to the Great Lakes system. And canals work on a levee system. Like they have a canal, they fill it up with water, you move the boat up this canal, when it gets to the other one, you raise it a little higher, and then at some point you start dropping back down, right? So it's kind of like the Panama Canal, where you lift water, move water from one lock to another, and then on the other side you start going back down. Now it's paid for by a combination of state and private funding, very little federal funds. Canals cut shipping costs for Western farmers and Eastern manufacturers, and with the addition of steamboats in the rivers, it also reduced shipping costs. Because we do have the rise of commercial agriculture. The lower South is growing cotton. The West is growing various goods. In the Northeast, you have, of course, Pennsylvania, which is a breadbasket in all of the above. They're growing winter wheat, winter rye. They're growing cereals. Of course, the South is only producing cotton. And because England needs cotton, they're buying it. But remember, once we get into the 1850s and 1860s, when England taps into Egypt and to India for cotton, the demand for American cotton is going to severely decline. And also, Indian cotton and Egyptian cotton is far better cotton. It is not short stable cotton, it is long stable cotton, and it's much better. A student asked me what the difference is, as for example, American cotton is used for t-shirts, flannel. It's very coarse. It has to be brushed because it's very rough. So once they make something, they kind of have, whereas Indian cotton and Egyptian cotton, it's very fine. So you can make like 1,000 count thread sheets or really nice cotton shirts. But you can't do that with American cotton. Now in today's world, they do grow some cotton called Pima cotton in Arizona that is just as good as Egyptian cotton. But at this time, in the 1820s and 30s, you don't have that, okay? So we begin to see these things. Okay, so we begin to see the production of interchangeable parts. We begin to see Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin, which is going to put, now instead of having 100 slaves comb 10 pounds of cotton, you have 2 slaves or 3 slaves combing 100 pounds of cotton a day, which is going to create an increase in cotton plantation and an increase in slave demand. It's not going to be a good thing, okay? So because of that, we begin to see, because of Eli Whitney's cotton gin and other interchangeable parts, we begin to see the explosion of slavery to an area of it, to a level that we hadn't seen. So remember, before it wasn't really burgeoning, but when the British in the North start buying cotton from the South, cotton is king. Okay, so that is going to create some serious problem. So rather than the old style farmer who sold directly to the buyer, what we have now is that we have a farmer selling to a local merchant and local merchant buying to a final market. And this system allowed farmers and local merchants to establish lines of credit, and this need for credit stimulates banking. Okay, the federal government issued too little money, so private banks continued to issue private notes, and this creates problems because maybe some of these notes aren't dealt with, are not honored in other banks, and some banks had better assets than others. So we do begin to see those problems. It's why we see the rise of the factory system, as I said, interchangeable parts. We begin to see it known as the putting out system, where merchants deliver raw materials from farms and families to artisans, and different artisans produce different things. So you may get pig hides from a pig farmer, and then you tan them, and then you sell the tan hides to a cobbler, and the cobbler cuts them into patterns for shoes, and then he gives them to somebody else, and they assemble the shoes. So it is all broken down. It is not disruptive to agricultural patterns. So they can be planting, they can be working on other things, and create this mini factory system. And it actually is stimulated by the increased demand of mass-produced goods, is of course with interchangeable parts. So the textile industry leads to the development in the factory system, where in the West and in the South, for local artisans, we have the putting out system. So you may have individuals on farms that are spinning the cotton, and then of course they send the spun cotton to the textile mills, and then they make them into actual textiles, material, género, which is géneros in Spanish. Now, of course, New England politicians wanted high protective tariffs to protect the goods that were in the United States, and of course, many in the South and in the West didn't want high protective tariffs because the goods that were coming in were going to be more expensive. That means the value of the goods that they were producing was going to decrease. And while we see the United States begin to adopt a model of modern 1840 and 1850 factory system, it is not an industrial country yet, but it's evolving as a market economy, and so it's doing really, really well. Okay, so what's going to happen is that we're going to start going into the age of Jackson, and what I'm going to tell you is that the era of good feelings, depending on who you ask, is either going to end in 1824 with the bitter election between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Okay, and of course the guy that derails that election is going to be Henry Clay. Of course, Monroe is going to serve 2 terms, and then he's going to step away. And then in 1824, we're going to have an election between Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and of course Andrew Jackson. Okay, now Henry Clay is represented by the North and the West, in some of the North, and of course John Quincy Adams has a lot of support in the northeastern United States. So in the first ballot, Henry Clay is done away with almost immediately, and what happens is that Jackson and John Quincy Adams are left, and after a lot of political maneuvering or chicanery or whatever you want to say it, Henry Clay is able to convince individuals to cast their vote for John Quincy Adams. Now, what happens here is that Andrew Jackson is going to win the popular vote by very little, and he is going to lose the electoral vote, the electoral college. Okay, and that's just simplified. Okay, and he's going to cry corrupt bargain. Okay, what does Henry Clay get out of it? He becomes Secretary of State. So as you can see here, John Quincy Adams becomes the president. And like his dad, he's a very qualified individual to be president, but he's very by the book. And he is not in touch with the common people. He's a wealthy guy. And he's very stubborn. But he is also, like I said, the guy got it up here. After he's president, he actually becomes senator, and is senator for a long time after that. I believe he's the only president to ever do that. What does happen is that in 1824, the era of good feelings slowly, begrudgingly comes to an end. John Quincy Adams' administration is really not anything to do anything about. We have the Tariff of Abominations, where tariff rates were so incredibly high that they even hurt the northeastern United States. And what we begin to see here is that we begin to see a split between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, okay? And, of course, Jackson is going to leave, and when Jackson leaves, he cries corrupt bargain, and then another guy, Martin Van Buren, known as the Little Magician, is going to create the Democratic Party. And then, of course, because Jackson is a man of the people, he is a self-made man, a popular hero, supports universal male suffrage, he fears money power is going to go after the bank. And in 1828, Andrew Jackson is going to get elected in a landslide election with the help of John Quincy Adams and a lot of disgruntled Republicans. So you have the creation of the two-party system now. You are going to have the Whigs come in every once in a while, for a while in the future, but they're not going to. So after Jackson, after Jackson, we are going to have James K. Polk, who is, I'm pretty sure he's a Whig. Maybe it has escaped me. Uh, and that's going to be it. After Jackson, we're going to have Martin Van Buren be the president, and his presidency is also going to be a disaster. But it's not going to be totally his fault. It's going to be because of what's left over from Jackson and all the not disaster, but well, you know what Jackson, Jacksonian America, the wrath that Jackson wrought on the country. So this concludes the lecture. Of course, this concludes the Era of Good Feelings. Remember, this is I just skimmed through it. You're still responsible for your identifies, for watching additional videos, and for especially those of you in the 8-week class. Do not take for granted that this is all you need to do, because if you just listen to this lecture, you're going to find yourself in a predicament. Now, is there a lot of good information in this lecture? Absolutely. Absolutely so. Okay? So, you all take care, be kind to each other, and I will see you in class.